Welcome everybody. I'm going to say a few introductory words and then I'm going to introduce the speakers. Recent campaigns for social justice have identified work and the workplace as major terrains for confronting colonialism, patriarchy, climate crisis, ableism, homophobia and transphobia, as well as class. Social justice is incompatible with pay gaps based on ethnicity, gender and disability. Degraded pay, unmanageable workloads and casualisation all disproportionately impact women and people of colour. Institutional racism does not always appear as a problem of work, or every institution is a workplace. The climate crisis cannot be adequately addressed without the radical reorganisation of working patterns, the workplace and the purpose of work. And the term intersectionality was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw to highlight, in her words, the various ways in which race and gender interact to shape the multiple dimensions of Black women's employment. Cultural work has taken on new meanings over the last 2 decades. How has neoliberalism and new technologies impacted on art, craft and design? Is the demand for the payment of interns and the campaign for fees or wages for cultural workers an act of social justice or an assertion of privilege? How do these campaigns relate to questions about the exploitation of assistants and other support workers in art, craft and design? Work is also at the heart of the call for a universal basic income that promises to allow everyone more time to make art, craft and design as forms of leisure. And what about the dream of an automated future without work? During the pandemic, a new category of essential workers was created that highlighted the social contribution of health workers, transport workers, teachers and others. Are we, the workers in art, craft and design, essential? And how might we rethink art, craft and design in the wake of new questions around working from home, the work-life balance, the ecological benefit of not commuting, the purpose and character of city centres and the relationship between urban and rural regions? Has work been marginalised in discussions of social justice? Have art, craft and design found other routes to social justice rather than through concepts of work? Or have these 3 elements recently converged in a new tendency for cultural activism? Let me briefly introduce the invited speakers. Dr. Susan Jones is an independent arts researcher working across creative industries and academia. As director of AN, the Artist Information Company, until 2014, she led realisation by artists of UK initiatives such as Networking Artist Networks and the Paying Artist Campaign. Her 2019 doctorate at Manchester Metropolitan examined the interrelationship between art policy and artists' livelihoods. Writing has been published by Art Review, Arts Professional, Corridor 8, Double Negative, The Guardian, Sluice, if that's how you pronounce it, Trans Artists and AN, the Artist Information Company. Presentations include Finding Freedom, Artists' Livelihoods in 2021, a camp, Confronting Disturbance, Artists' Livelihoods in a COVID World, The Coast is Queer, Blackpool, Getting Ahead, Strategies for Artists' Livelihoods, CVAN Equity Policy Group, Could Do Better, The Exceptional Impact of COVID-19 Emergency Measures on Visual Artists with Chronic Conditions, Another Art World, Manifestations and Conditions of Equity in Visual Arts, Belgrade, Artists' Livelihoods, Prospects and Barriers, Loughborough University, MA Creative Industries, and What's Best for Artists' Livelihoods, University of Huddersfield / Temporary Contemporary. Dr. Kylie Jarrett is Associate Professor in the Department of Media Studies at Maynooth. Did I pronounce that right? Maynooth University. She is author of Feminism, Labour and Digital Media, The Digital Housewife, and the forthcoming Digital Labour, which will be out in June. She is also co-author of #NSFW, Sex, Humour and Risk in Social Media, and Google and the Culture of Search. She has published extensively on the political economy of the commercial web using Marxist and feminist approaches. David Hesmondhalgh is Professor of Media, Music and Culture at the University of Leeds. Among his books are The Cultural Industries, a critical history of that sector since the 1970s, now in its 4th edition, and Creative Labor, a study of working conditions in the cultural industries, published in 2010 and co-written with Sarah Baker. He's currently working on the impacts of digital platforms on musical production and consumption, while also trying to write a book about capitalism, culture and human flourishing in the digital arts. Dani Child is Senior Lecturer in Art History at Manchester School of Art, Manchester Metropolitan University. Her research adopts an historical materialist approach to explore the relationship between contemporary art and capitalism through the lens of labour. This interest includes social, brackets, collective, participatory and public, artistic practices, contracted labour, including the invisible hands of production in art, and contemporary art and social class. She's published articles in Third Text, Art in the Public Sphere, and Sculpture Journal. Her book, Working Aesthetics, Labour, Art and Capitalism, was published in January 2019 with Bloomsbury Academic, and she's currently working as editor on the Routledge Companion to Art and Capitalism. Jade Montserrat is an artist based in Whitby, England, but currently on the borders of Scotland. She was the recipient of the Stuart Hall Foundation Scholarship, supporting her PhD via MPhil at IBAR UCLAN, and the development of her work from her Black diasporic perspective in the north of England. Jade works through performance, drawing, painting, film, installation, sculpture, print, and text. So I'm going to ask each of you a question just to get us all started. And I'm going to go in the same order that I gave the biographies. Sue, you've studied for many years the material circumstances of artists and campaigned for artists to be paid fairly for the work they do. Do you think that artists are exploited?
Well, that's a great question, and it's caused me a great deal of thinking, not least of which thinking back to how I used to think about these things and how differently perhaps I think about them now. So the answer to our artists exploited must be yes, no, and maybe. You could argue that they are, but it's not intentional. Nobody means to exploit artists. Artists don't mean to be exploitable or exploited. It's just that there's not enough information around so that people don't know how to do it better. On both sides, whether that's practitioners or people who advocate for artists or people who employ artists. So, or you could say, well, it's a lack of understanding amongst salaried people about the notion of being freelance. But as you've said in your introduction, there's an awful lot of information around about that. Or similarly, it could be, well, you know, what else can we do? We're in this political climate. We've had neoliberalism now for an awful long time, and it's not going anywhere anytime soon. So we're stuck with it. Yesterday afternoon, I had the dubious pleasure of sitting in on a virtual workshop looking at how legible and credible and deliverable the Arts Council's investment principles are, along with a bunch of freelancers. There wasn't any visual artists there, I have to say. There was one or two dancers and one or two theatre practitioners. But what was clear about that was the general consensus was that it was a load of jargon. And that, in a sense, individuals working in the arts are just little mini institutions, really. Horrifyingly, you discover that, you know, people who are successful in writing applications and so on are so because somebody's written it for them. You know, it's not the artist's voice, it's an interpretation. So you could say that there's no understanding of what the good conditions are for practitioners, and money's only just one of those. There's generic assumptions about the value of trickle down, and there's no understanding of the nature of artist precarity, which is not just financial, but is emotional and structural. Or is it that, you know, when the Arts Council sets out something that says we expect everybody to pay artists fairly, that they're not being explicit enough? Because on the other hand, they're telling applicants that they're putting in too high rates for artists. And how can they justify that? I hear from artists. Everything's stacked around resilience for organisations, and resilience for organisations doesn't make resilience for individuals. It's different. So, like I say, there's lots of evidence around, if only people wanted to know how to do it better. And I spent, you know, my doctorate sort of getting to grips with that. I don't think the solutions lie in top-down policies, and we can talk more about that. But they certainly aren't going to lie in where all the vested interests are. So yes, no, and maybe are all there on the table. And I think, as Dave said, that we need to examine how to remove the need to even have that question.
Thanks so much, Sue. I've got a question for Dani now. Your book, Work in Aesthetics, examines the relationship between artists and the hidden hands of assistants and fabricators who actually make artworks. Is the relationship between artists and craftspeople and designers and skilled workers who produce their work, is that a problematic relationship?
So my response is a little bit like Sue's in that it depends. I think, I mean, my kind of use of the term hidden hands is to kind of problematize this kind of this invisibility of labour, of these kind of employed assistants and fabricators. Some of these relationships are really problematic. If you read accounts from the 1990s of assistants who have worked for artists who ignore them at previews and purposefully, you know, kind of obfuscate them, then yeah, it's really problematic. Economically, absolutely problematic. I'm assuming that the wage isn't kind of commensurate to the work that they actually do, especially if you're thinking about, you know, the big named artists who in the kind of early 2000s were paying their painters, their assistants who paint their work around what, £19,000 a year, and selling works for, you know, hundreds of thousands. So, you know, economically, I think it's problematic. It's probably more problematic for people who assist painters. I think it's more hidden because the artist's hand is still kind of fetishized in these relationships. I think for fabricators, it's a little bit different because you've got kind of businesses that have been established that are specifically, you know, there to facilitate artists in manufacturing things, and it's a different kind of economic relationship. So there's a whole load of ways of thinking about this. I think historically it's problematic asking questions about who's doing the hiding. Is it the artist? Is it the art historian? You know, my discipline of art history is incredibly problematic. So yeah, I mean, some of these relationships work really well. You know, some kind of artists have a lot of respect for their assistants, and I think they're paid better than others. But it's so hidden, and finding the detail, particularly the economic detail, is really quite difficult. And getting inside of fabricators is really difficult as well, to find out what actually goes on and how labour's divided and those kind of things. So yeah, it depends it under which conditions you're looking at it, I guess. I think the system fundamentally is problematic, and the kind of the art market that fosters this kind of hidden labour is is problematic.
Great, thank you. Kylie, in your book, The Digital Housewife, you identified the marginalization of feminist thought in discussions of online reproductive labor. Can you say something about how feminism helps to rethink the politics and economics of those activities that we do for love or pleasure, and therefore don't typically recognize as labor, but which contribute to the super profits of platform capitalism?
Yeah, so one of the things I guess one of the frameworks I use in the kind of emerged out of, or I use within the Digital Housewife book, is it draws on Marxist feminist principles, and it draws on a particular social reproduction theory, which is very much focused on not just, asserting the economic value of domestic labor and activity that happens in the social reproductive sphere. It does that. It's about arguing. We need to look at it. But what it also does is it draws our attention to the idea of the labor and how the labor isn't fully formed and then goes to the workplace and comes back and is exactly the same each time. It draws our attention to the making and remaking of subjectivities. So that arena of social reproduction and the role of that within capitalism and how capitalism shapes that creates this very complicated kind of subjectivities and draws our attention to all those spaces where that subjectivity is made and remade and potentially unmade. And if we're talking about questions of social justice, drawing our attention to the kind of unmaking of the kind of labouring and capitalist subjectivities is really, I think, quite important. To me, that was one of the greatest insights we get from kind of using kind of feminist perspectives. I mean, the other one is, of course, the yes, no, maybe of exploitation, because yes, it's exploitative, but it's also affective and meaningful and rich, and that's the nature of domestic labour as well, right? So that's the association I make between user labour and domestic work, is that it is both these things at the same time. But kind of going back to the question of kind of social justice and struggle, I guess labour struggle, which is what I'm kind of been interested in a lot more in this new book, the Digital Labour book. Because in that book, I'm looking across the broad digital labour economy, so looking at people ranging from, programming tech bros at Google to, YouTubers and influencers and delivery riders and a whole spectrum. But one of the things, again, that same kind of feminist lens is brought my attention to questions of struggle. So there's a whole chapter about labour struggle, and there's so much focus on the delivery riders and their industrial action and their kind of classic forms of labour struggle. But there's all these other forms of labour struggle which are happening in the kind of subjective social reproduction arena. So I particularly use Sophie Bishop's work on algorithmic gossip. She talks about influencers and YouTubers engaging in Instapods, or they come together in groups to try collectively to figure out the algorithm. So to create, so they can game the algorithm and, increase their incomes and what have you. And they also have banded together to kind of speak back and push back against the kind of the injustices, the kind of racial apartheid that happens in algorithmic logics and in platforms. And they've been pushing back against that. This isn't like formalized industrial action, and it's, often it's just a community of coping, right? That people have created, which, in kind of classic industrial labour terms, just kind of sutures people more securely into capitalism. It's not proper like Marxist revolution, but it is still resistance. It is still struggle, and it's really important because it's about these private interpersonal dynamics that are about subjectivity and affect and interpersonal stuff that this is all kind of located in, I think. And again, so I think that's been kind of undervalued in the digital labour literature, particularly, it's been undervalued. So I think bringing that out, that not all labour struggle is about that big structural transformation. Some of it is just about coping. And that's worth noticing and recognising and engaging with. Is that, and talking about the cultural activism, and I think this is really important, to be rethinking our ideas of struggle in the current economy, because, and particularly for looking at artists and craft workers, who are kind of that emblematic of what digital labourers do, is what craft workers and artists, that kind of structural relationship to capitalism, those regimes of self-employment and self-exploitation, put a very different kind of structural framework on what labour struggle can be. If you don't have an employer, who are you struggling against? So there's a whole rethinking, and as that's becoming a kind of very prevalent model of employment, is this kind of real or bogus self-employment, then there's other dynamics we need to be looking towards, I think. And again, artists show us the way in that. And just one example of what I think is going on now, the Etsy strike of the other week is a really interesting example of this kind of new complicated types of labour struggles that are going on, that are kind of partly withdrawal of labour, but also partly a consumer boycott, but also something else. And I think there's some stuff going on about how resistance is manifesting, that is revealed by kind of feminists focusing on social reproduction, but also just more stuff we need to think about there. Sorry, that's just me going off on one for a bit. Sorry.
It was brilliant. Thank you. Jade, the art world is sometimes thought of as a haven from the horrors of the wider world, and a liberal, progressive and ethical space that leads the way in questions of social justice. I'm not saying that I think that, I'm saying it has been thought of as that. Is contemporary art an environment in which you as an artist can pursue questions of social justice?
Thank you. It's such an excellent question. And yeah, thanks everyone else. It's good to meet everyone and hear from everybody. Following on, I think, but also specifically from my own experience as an artist, in sort of a short monosyllabic answer, yes. For me, well, there's two ways I'd like to sort of consider this. Firstly, I think being an artist has led me to sort of make work that can utilize a sort of a platform that I have been privileged to sort of have generated alongside people sort of championing my work, so that it allows me to then use that space and my work to recognise where there are social injustices, and also learn from my peers and academics like yourselves, so that I'm networked to be more aware than previously. So my background is similarly originally in history of art. I studied at Courtauld, where I studied 18th century art, and there was no mention that I recall of the transatlantic slave trade. So I'm coming to social justice as well from the from having experienced how challenging working within the art world is. So yes, whilst it can be a haven, because it is, maybe the art world itself isn't what I consider the haven. It's the making that's the haven. It's the engaging with others that's the haven. But the structure of the art world is exploitative, from my experience, and is, as Susan, whose work with AN really, when I was starting out on a foundation course following my history of art degree, I need to just stress how important AN has, and Susan's work has been for me, as recognizing AN as a place that was safe to recognize what was going on in the art world, in inverted commas, except it was wider than the art world, I felt, if that makes sense at all. I'm not sure. What I mean by that is that I consider the art world as sort of fully conforming and adhering to a top-down sort of power base, and I didn't, excuse me, bed. Good girl. Yes, I think I'm thinking about the haven as being the act of our imaginations, the act of us sort of growing together, recognizing together, learning together, actually seeing that creativity is a means with which we can prolong our learning, or sort of commit to lifelong learning. And I'm a real advocate for that, in that we're learning intergenerationally. I was just thinking, when I'm speaking aloud now, thinking about someone like Oscar Murillo's work, for instance, who were, and lots of artists who utilize children's work as well. Like you were talking about earlier, labor, and actually that work that I saw of his, say, in Venice, where he'd worked with school children, I think, from around the world, and actually how generationally, not just assistants, we sort of recognize how we're sort of almost like magpies in that way, and that's pertinent to social justice, because I'm clearly kind of sort of sensitive also to being on social media platforms where I'm learning all the time, or being bombarded actually by news stories, whereby, there's social injustices. We can't move for social injustices that are proliferating as we speak. I'm sure just after these 2 hours, something else will knock us sideways. And I think that for me, it's a way to process those, especially in these last few years as well, where we've been physically isolated from each other. Again, I grew up in physical isolation. I grew up in the sticks, with generated electricity, no terrestrial television, and so for me, the act of making something was a way to process this very, very different world that I was living in as a mixed heritage, but with no mirror. I lived in exclusively white environments. So it's sort of now I'm able to step back and pursue these questions retrospectively and contemporaneously. Thank you. I wonder if that in part way answers the question.
That was an extremely rich response to a very brief question. So thank you very much. Dave, you've researched widely on the economics, politics and legal frameworks of the music industry and the cultural industries generally, are new economies and new technologies introducing new threats to cultural production today?
Yeah, it depends what you mean by new, of course. And I always try and look at these things in the long term. And I think you can see historically over 50, 60 years, maybe more, an increasing commodification of culture. And by that, I guess I mean culture is becoming increasingly important to capitalist economies. And that's a kind of strategic move. You know, it didn't happen by accident. It was in many ways planned. It was a result of events in the global economy, 50s and 60s, things like the idea that we need that Western countries needed to build knowledge economies and so on in order to counter the growing threat from, for example, Southeast Asia in terms of global competition. So I think, you know, just to look at it in the most macro way possible, you can see that, and this is intensifies, I think, in the 80s and 90s greatly. And then you get the development of ideas such as the creative industries, which is a kind of an idea that government's role, rather than providing public provision for the benefit of all, supposedly, though not in practice very often, shifts towards the idea that that art and culture is making an economic contribution, and with those events, and just to finish this long-term story very quickly, what you then get in the 2000s is, with the consequence of the knowledge economy taking the form of the rise of IT, of the IT sector, you get the rise of platform companies, which are now increasingly involved in the business of art and culture. Putting all these together, I think that we now have something that we could call a crisis in culture. We have financial crises, we have a crisis of democracy, we have a crisis of care. History is full of crisis. Contemporary capitalism is full of crisis. So it's no surprise perhaps that there's what I would think of as a crisis in culture. And that doesn't mean to say that it's over. I'm going to paint a slightly dark picture. I really endorse some of the things other people were saying, including Kylie, about, you know, there's still agency, there's still contradiction, there's still ambivalence. Art and culture still provide lots of sources of human flourishing for those who make it and those who consume it. But I think if we look at the fate of ideas such as independence and the alternative of alternative culture, I think they're in decline to such a degree that many people can't even use those words anymore. I mean, if I was to ask what's the alternative to music streaming as a way of gaining access to music, for example, well, people might say Bandcamp, they might say, you know, nice local record shops, but they are much less significant alternatives than the equivalents of 30, 50 years ago, I would say. And I think another element of what I'm thinking of as a crisis in culture is that the abundance and diversity of culture that's undoubtedly offered by all these digital devices seems to be widely experienced as empty and meaningless, and that culture's closely connected in many people's minds to widespread feelings of anxiety, alienation, competitive individualism, perhaps most notably in the social media manifestations, but beyond that too. And if we just temporarily divide culture for the sake of a distinction between, you know, the side of culture that's about public knowledge and information versus entertainment, stimulation, and so on. On the information knowledge side, the key institutions, really flawed, terribly flawed institutions, such as journalism, universities, science, are all now the object of huge public suspicion, even animosity. You know, we know that story, right? I mean, COVID brought that out even more clearly. On the side of entertainment, art, and so on, that side of culture, you also have a sense of crisis, a sense of difficulties in articulating what the value of culture is, a sense that it all boils down to individual taste and economic choices, economic preferences. Neoliberalism and postmodernism, I think, have fed into a kind of cynicism about art and culture. Now, it seems to me likely that those things are going to affect cultural workers. It's going to affect the very nature of cultural work. And of course, people find all kinds of resources of hope. And there's a massive amount of social justice work going on in the arts and cultures. Again, I'm not trying to say that the whole thing is finished, but it takes place in what I would say is a context of crisis. And I can talk more about some of the elements of that crisis, maybe, if you want, later, and also qualify it more with that hope and with the complexity of what's happening on the ground, I think, in people's actual cultural work, including the music industries, which is music, which is where I'm doing most of my research at the moment.
Brilliant. Thanks, Dave, and thanks everyone for responding to those questions so brilliantly. Does anyone, because I can see some of you are like writing notes and things, does anyone already have a question for one of the other speakers, or already have a kind of a comment in relation to what someone has said, or has something further to say that develops on what you originally said? Okay, I'll try and tease it out of you then. Because Sue, I did notice that when Kylie used the phrase self-exploitation, you leant over and wrote a little note. So I wonder whether that was something that you maybe hadn't developed as much in your first answer, and maybe you'd like to add that to the discussion now.
Yes, I mean, I think it's interesting because arguably that's one of the problems, you know, because artists enjoy what they're doing and in fact, you know, have to do the things that they're doing because otherwise they feel ill. You know, this kind of, I don't want to sound over romanticized about this, but when I was an artist and I didn't do anything for a while, I kind of felt this great sort of gnawing pain of there being something missing. I don't feel quite that about writing, but you know, there is a similarity. It's what makes you you as a person, as an art practitioner, that, you know, therefore you kind of put up with things that aren't quite right to get the bits that you do want that are right. And in a sense, you know, that's okay. That's, you know, that's human, that's kind of thing. I found myself earlier this week talking myself out of doing some work because it wasn't quite the right thing for my knowledge. I didn't feel it was quite right and the money wasn't right. So I mentioned both of those things. The latter was solvable, but the former wasn't. So I didn't get that piece of work. And I felt, well, that was all right because it was the wrong kind of, but actually, you know, what is going to pay those bills next month? So I think there's an interesting thing, but I also think that the exploiters of artists rely upon that generosity, that willingness, as well as the fact that everybody has to eat. You know, everybody has to pay these extra high cost of living and so on. So I think there is an insidiousness going on there. And I think your point also about coping strategies, you know, everybody has them. I just want to add one other thing that I haven't talked about in my run through, which I was on a series of post-it notes. I just finished, or I'm just in the process of doing some research looking at how artists fared during the pandemic, and as Dave knows, and you've read the paper, the submission I made to the DCMS inquiry, it looked dreadful. It looked absolutely awful from all the statistical data. But actually, if you delve down and talk in depth and listen rather than talk, listen in depth to artists, what I found was actually it wasn't really like that, that the closing down of those institutions that operate in that kind of way, that want products in that kind of way, that have this much money, the closing down of all that was actually very good for artists. And there was one source of funding that was no strings funding, which was if artists had a designated studio that was recognised as a studio through the local authority rating system, they automatically got a £10,000 grant. And it proved absolutely categorically the value of that kind of no strings R&D funding, which has already been proved before, but which the Arts Council has gradually removed in favour of the service industry. So there is a kind of a big light there to shine on the exploitation of saying, actually giving artists time and space to be what artists are good at. And I'm not romanticising that, but they are citizens, they are people, their kids are at school, and the fact that that child has an artist as a parent has an influence on the nuance of education, if you like. It does sound a bit sort of touchy-feely 70s, doesn't it, there? But, there are, we, have maybe a political awareness or a social awareness or just maybe it's a more caring attitude, I don't know. And I'm generalising there because I'm not an artist. But there's something, maybe I'm romantic, maybe there is a counter to the thrall of neoliberalism, the economic values, anything's good as long as you can hold it up and it shines a light.
There was an element of that linked to your presentation, wasn't there, Kylie? About we often talk about, some of us often talk about how the worker must also be conceived as a person, as having this life outside of work, that they're not just an economic unit, and then that brings in all the questions about subjectivity but also social reproduction, but also that it's in that space outside of work where you've got the potential for political emancipation, for resistance, for protest, and so on and so forth. But actually, before Sue said that, I always apply that to the worker, but I've never applied it to the artist. But Sue's just talked about that in terms of the artist, and so I wondered whether you had anything to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the other things I talk about in the new book, which is out in June, if anyone wants it, I can also put a discount code flyer in the chat if anyone's interested. Did I mention I have a new book coming out in June? I've got a new book coming out in June. And that will relate to what I'm about to say. One of the chapters is about commodification, and it's looking at that commodification of subjectivity, which is kind of some ways what we're talking about here, that bit where your whole sense of self becomes effectively the product, and which is very much connected, of course, again to the online creator industry, who are artists of their own kind. They also do a lot of unpaid work as well. And Brooke Duffy's book about beauty bloggers is called, in brackets, Not Getting Paid to Do What You Love. And it's all about the free labor and unpaid labor that goes into blogging and influencing and that sector, which again, maps onto the artists, kind of historic relations. But I talk about commodification, I kind of want to shift the narrative to talk about it, because commodification, like to be commodified, is a very dispossessing state, right? According to look at it, it's like you are if your whole subjectivity becomes commodified, then you have no capacity for action outside of capital, right? Outside of kind of capitalist enterprise. I've been drawing on the work of Michel Fair, talking about it as, instead of commodification, as assetization, because the asset is a different thing. Like the asset, you retain, like you put it up for valuation, you monetize it, you commercialize it, but you don't sell it, you don't give it away. You still retain possession over it. You have the subjective agency, which I think makes some really interesting sense for understanding the type of work, particularly online creative stuff, but also most kinds of work these days, which require this kind of investment of subjectivity. Like you're required to be, I'm an academic and my entire subjectivity is part of my work, right? But I'm assetizing it in various ways. I think there's, I've just kind of started that, and I think there's probably more to be done there. It's kind of just one chapter in a book, and it's kind of merged magically in the middle of COVID as an idea as I was writing the book. But I think there's something there that gives us that space for hope, gives us that space for flourishing, that capacity for flourishing that Dave is talking about, as potentially being undermined and savaged by the politics of the day and the economics of the day, because they're the same thing quite often.
Please go for it, Jade.
Okay, great, thank you. It's really interesting to hear, Kylie, you use, I'm not sure if fully, the use of the word asset, and or actually the work being the asset, that means that perhaps our subjectivity as an artist isn't the where the value is placed, if that's how I understand it. And on this residency here at Alchemy Festival, they talk, where I've been for the past 6 months, working specifically to make and observe being in Hawick, to make something for the community, for the school children here. So they talked in terms of assets, which was really new to me. So what it is that I produce, instead of it being called an outcome, it's called an asset, and both of which have grated with me. At first it sounded jargonese, but now I can value how that apportions a value beyond myself, or which has actually been really helpful in the long run. And I just, I wanted to mention that, and also I was really gratified, Susan, when you mentioned about the pain of not making work. And so currently I'm what I've been calling a gigging artist. So instead of making work that I want to make, I am in this fortunate position where I've sort of carved a sort of niche for myself, for want of a better word, whereby I can come in and do the work about little known or underrepresented histories, specifically to do with Black histories. That isn't what I set out to do as an artist. I'm fortunate to be able to do it, but this is me working to afford to be able to make the work that I want to do eventually. So when I started out, after my MA, did the History of Art degree, then did a foundation course in Norwich, and then I did an MA between 2008 and 2010 in Norwich again. After that time, I was working 5 jobs. I was working as a dinner lady for one. I was working in care work at MenCap simultaneously. So there were 5 simultaneous jobs. I was living in a bedsit, but I had my first studio. And I don't want to labour the point, but it seems there's some sort of glaring kind of sorry, I'm just going to have to bend down over here to locate whatever it is that Hilda's lost under the table, or maybe try and find something equivalent. But yeah, it seems not unconnected when we're talking about neoliberalism that I got into a situation where I was working these 5 jobs and I was exploited, and I was exploited because I wanted to make work so badly, and I didn't have the means to do that. So how that formed was over several years, whereby I was paid £400 a month to be able to make. I would have to then bring 10 watercolours to London, but there was I was racially abused, and there was sexual abuse there as well, and that was enabling me to make my work. And what I have to say about that is also around class. So it's what I wanted to mention was that if you have the means to support yourself to make work, then that's all great. But if you're in a scenario where you've grown up in sort of abusive environments, whatever it is, how you've grown up, and you're not, maybe you haven't got the access into culture, then there is this phenomenal sort of opening for exploitation there, just to be able to make work. So it's no surprise that after 2 years now, I'm still in the process of suing the Tate. And of course, the Tate Modern being a place that was set up by the now King of the Arts Council, who I don't believe, who is sort of like the king of neoliberalism too. So it's how we sort of articulate these scenarios to people who are so divorced, unconnected, and uninvested actually for the change to come about. And that includes sort of monolithic institutions like the Tate, who are not, surface or superficially that they're interested in social justice, and in artists on the individual level who are able to be the spokesperson for the social injustice. But structurally, they're not geared up to the change. So I just wanted to mention how I think also you spoke earlier about internships. Again, you can only access those if you are from a particular background initially. I think they're inaccessible I just believe that access to culture at all is almost inaccessible for a great swathe of the population.
Thank you so much. I'm so grateful for that contribution. I'm also now a little bit concerned that nobody will want to speak after that. Oh, Kylie, please go ahead.
Yeah, I was wondering, just speaking on class, and I'm wondering if in Dani's work, I was really interested in the idea of the invisible labour of the art world, and I'd love to hear more about that, and whether in your research there's a class dimension or even a cultural capital dimension to who does the invisible labour, and I'd love to know more about that.
Yeah, class is really important to my research and my work. I come from working class background, and I think part of this task of making labour visible definitely comes from my own experience of not seeing the workers, or you know, discovering that artists have assistants who make work for them at undergraduate level, and kind of thinking, oh, okay, we never hear about these people. And you know, my dad's a mechanic by trade. He works with his hands. So I was really interested in why these people kind of being hidden from these narratives of art history. So yeah, absolutely, it's a really classed discipline. And you know, those people who are employed as assistants by artists, you know, either kind of graduates or people studying fine art who are in the position to be, I guess, exploited in some ways, or you know, who can work for less pay and contribute to, you know, to the work of more privileged artists. So there is a class dimension in terms of thinking about the artists fabricators, the fabrication firms, like the ones that are set up in the United States in the 1960s and 70s. The workers who are employed there, the makers, often come from industries like shipbuilding, and so they're people who are skilled trades people, you know, they're not trained artists, they've not been to art school, and that's purposeful because they have the skills to work with big metal sculpture, fabricate, you know, these giant works at the time. And so again, there's a class dimension there, that you've got the kind of the employed skilled manual worker within these art factories, as they were sometimes termed. So yeah, it's definitely a classed relationship between the employment of kind of skilled workers to fabricate and sometimes paint works of art. Yeah, absolutely. Class is inherent within that.
Dani, is there any literature on other forms of exploitation within that relationship?
What do you mean? In what way?
Well, Jade was talking about racial and sexual abusive relationships within the art world, and I wondered whether there was any. You'd think, in theory, that that relationship between an artist and their assistants would be, and you know, in some instances, an unsafe environment. And I wondered whether there was any mention of that in the literature anywhere.
I haven't come across it, but then there's very little literature about artist assistants. You know, the kind of text that I always go back to is this Wade Saunders one in Art in America from the 90s, where assistants talked, or established artists talked about being assistants, or assistants talked about working for them. There's still kind of very little discourse on it, and I wonder if this is because you know, there is exploitation. I mean, you've got the history of kind of married couples working together. You know, kind of male artists' wives sewing things for their sculpture and those kind of relationships, which often has a gendered hierarchy within that. But I haven't come across anything, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I just think that people are not speaking about it or writing about it.
Could I just say something, Dave, about a couple of issues that have come up that I think are really important when thinking about labour and justice in culture, in art, craft and design. That idea that people potentially can gain great rewards from undertaking that kind of work, the paradox that then becomes the basis of exploitation is, a really key idea, I think. And it was Andrew Ross who coined the phrase sacrificial labor many years ago. One of the first big pieces to appear about the problems of cultural work. About 1999, Andrew wrote that piece. And the economists talk in terms of labour of love, as an explanation of why are wages so low in the cultural and art sectors. The labour of love explanation is one way into that. And then another term that comes up, and I'm not necessarily endorsing the language here, just reporting it, but the idea of an oversupply of willing workers. It's very demand and supply curve driven idea, but because there's always somebody else who would be willing to do the work, that kind of generates the exploitation, as you might put it, from a more leftist perspective. And there's always been, though, I think, a dialectic between autonomy and control at the heart of cultural work that runs counter to some of that exploitation, potentially at least, even though, of course, the desire for autonomy and the reaching for autonomy then ends up making the work desirable, thereby generating the love of it and thereby generating the oversupply. It's so hard to unpick all these different dimensions, isn't it? But it seems as though the platform world, the platform economy, has generated even more opportunities for people to enter into cultural labour markets, because it's very easy, for example, to upload your own work. Just to take music as an example, or the creator economy that Kylie was talking about, uploading videos to YouTube or TikTok is relatively easy and relatively affordable in the digital world. So we got this new stage, really, of so-called oversupply, and a new stage in terms of precariousness and insecurity, where there's simply more competition for the work. And what's also happening within that is that all that precarious, insecure work is now prone to surveillance and datafication on the part of the platform companies. So I do think there's a way in which the last 10 years has seen a new type and a new degree of incorporation of cultural labour into capitalism, let's call it. But I just want to say a more positive thing about something that's happened over the last 20 years, as I see it anyway, and I'd be very interested to know if other people see it differently. It's that my experience growing up and being, fascinated by various forms of culture and the arts in the 80s and 90s, there was often a prevailing view, even amongst people who loved art and culture, of it's kind of a privilege to be in it, and you're not really workers like proper workers. That was certainly true in the working class community that I grew up in, that view. And I think that's changed. You know, I think this new world where the cultural labour forces are much bigger, even if they're precarious and insecure, and even if the unions have been more or less destroyed in many sectors, it has led to a kind of increasing public recognition that cultural workers are workers and deserve justice. And I think you see that in the public debates about the effects of music streaming platforms on the conditions of musicians. I think some of the contributions to that debate, by the way, I can talk a little bit more about this later if you want, are actually, you know, sometimes there isn't really evidence to support the claims that are being made, or they rely on rather tired tropes about, you know, the problems of musical culture. But all the same, I think it's led to this really good thing that people are concerned about A, whether musicians are making a living, and B, kind of how many musicians can make a sustainable living for music. That was never really a feature of anything beyond, you know, quite niche alternative cultural worlds in the 1980s, in my experience. So I just wanted to put that in as what I think is a real bit of progress.
I wonder if I could just pick up on the oversupply issue, because it's oft said, you know, one of the reasons that visual artists are so badly off is that there is an oversupply. In fact, I had a fascinating off the record conversation with somebody in one of the big funding bodies about this. And it wasn't an official position there, but it was definitely an underlying secret, widely held belief that things would be better for artists if there weren't quite so many of them. So one of the things I did in doctoral study, you know, you have lots of time to read things, was I tried to get to the bottom of this. And what I discovered was that in a period of just under 30 years, the size of visual people in visual arts occupations had increased by 42%, which was almost a self-fulfilling prophecy because of all the policies that had gone into place, certainly from the 90s onwards and then through New Labour and so on, to make that link between arts and economy and job creation. So, you know, whole new spheres of operation and job title appeared in the visual arts that never had before, like curator, for example, was very much an introduced term. So the number of artists are no more now, the actual finite number of artists, I squirreled away until I got a figure. There were no more artists at the point at which I finished my study in whatever it was, 2017, 2018 data, than there had been in the 80s, actually, when Andrew Brighton and co did their major study. But what had increased was all the other occupations, and you can see that, can't you? You know, if you increase the number of of institutions, you increase the number of people that inhabit them. And then what we could see during the pandemic was that the preservation of those institutions, the now CEOs, they weren't called that, were they, in the past? They were artistic directors, at best, directors of programme, I was, for a lot of my working life. You know, but not only that, the huge amounts of time and energy that needs to be put into fundraising in order to bump up the insufficient subsidy or investment, as the Arts Council now calls it. The marketing teams to draw in the peripheral income, you know, from both direct and indirect use. You know, the use of, what was it, the National Gallery ad said the other day, why not book us for your wedding? We're such a great backdrop, kind of thing. So, you know, inevitably, once those jobs have been created, those career paths have been created, it's not in the interests of the machinators, of the makers of cultural policy and delivery to say, well, actually, maybe we've got too many of those. But it's very convenient to say, well, it's the art schools' fault because they're turning out all this people that nobody wants. And of course, you know, the art schools, when I questioned them about this, said, well, we don't make courses according to whether there's any work for them. We're responding to demand. People want to do arts courses. And in fact, in times of strife, I might be wrong, Dave Beech, but more people want to do something which seems more worthwhile than joining in with the capitalists. You know, so consequently, I mean, I do think, you know, we don't have an oversupply of audiences, though, do we? Because, you know, 14% of them dropped off from the institutionally led arts that, you know, we've supposedly made the arts names around, or the name of the arts around. And the concern now is how to get that 14% back. Well, it still wasn't very many when it had that extra 14%, and it was still largely middle class. So it hasn't democratized the arts to have more institutions and more credibility through professional structures and job titles and so on and so forth. So there's too many sort of broken suppositions, aren't there, about, you know, how to make a, you know, you talked earlier about universal basic income, you know, universal access to the arts is part and parcel of that, isn't it?
It's quite interesting what you're saying, Sue, because obviously I was part of the COVID-19 big research project, and myself and Harry Weeks were looking at galleries and museums in the northwest and the northeast of England as part of that. And, you know, and other parts of the project were looking at audiences for, you know, different cultural forms like theatre and festivals and things. And everyone thought that this pivot to online that happened in the pandemic would somehow democratise audiences, and that new audiences would appear for the arts. And in fact, what happened is it was the same people who would have visited the galleries and museums or the theatre that went online, and this idea they would somehow reach the working classes and they'd all hop on as well, just wasn't the case in practice. So I think there really needs to be kind of more work done in order to make the arts accessible to, you know, to people from different communities and backgrounds. And I know that some institutions are doing that work, but certainly for me, I never went to galleries and museums as a child. I went walking in the Yorkshire Dales, or, you know, those kind of things. So, you know, they and, you know, that's in the 80s and 90s. There's still that gap.
Yeah, I think before we can talk about oversupply of cultural workers, we need to tackle the underrepresentation of people within culture, you know, and so the whole spectrum, basically, according to race, gender, sexuality, class, you name it. The culture sector underrepresents every dispossessed group, and
with the exception that the people who are over-represented in the cultural sector, in the creative workforce, if you like, are neurodivergent people, and that's not taken into account at all, is it?
It's not. But I think that if you think that the cultural sector If you think there's an oversupply of cultural workers, then you're not noticing that there is an undersupply of so many different types of cultural worker. So it's a very privileged statement to make, it seems to me.
Mm. It's a very convenient thing to put the blame, if you like, back on the artist, isn't it? You know, it's a convenient thing to put the blame back on the health worker, on the, you know, the care worker, the lorry driver, the, you know, it's a very kind of upper class British trick.
But let's not also forget that the cultural industries were coined as an industry as well that created these roles in new institutions. You know, as you know, the arts were fully kind of commodified at that point, turned into an industry. So there, you know, there's an impact of that these new roles emerge, and yeah.
I'm thinking about the online creator economy and underrepresentation, quite literally, in the sense, well, not literally, that people can represent themselves, diverse people can represent themselves, but then they become invisible through the algorithms, through the shadow banning practices of those platforms. And then it just struck me then that it's kind of replicating the algorithm works like cultural capital works in the arts industry. It stops you self-promoting, it stops you being seen, it stops you accruing the other forms of capital that might follow on. It just seemed like a delightful analogy that I'm going to have to go write down and exploit something somewhere later on.
May I ask, Kylie, about the shadow banning and the algorithms? Because I don't fully understand. I'm sure everyone else does, but if I was just, yeah, it sounds so, it feels so conspiratorial. It's clear, it's clear that it is happening, and I can see it happen, but I'm not sure how it happens and who makes it happen.
Yeah, well, that's the question. And the algorithms, because they're trained on normativity. So one of the so for instance, AIs. I was talking to Caroline Bassett about this. AIs get trained on what gets referred to as the common crawl. So they do a crawl through a kind of generic set of stuff. And from that, they train the AI. And so the AI learns to learn from that common crawl. But the common crawl is, of course, riddled with racism, sexism, homophobia, all the things of society. And so Caroline Bassett was arguing they need to do an uncommon crawl. So a crawl that's kind of predicated on social justice. So the algorithms that are used to kind of rank content or to bring stuff into people's feeds then are informed by these narratives. Plus, then you get the shadow banning is a lot more active. It's about people being flagged for, particularly happening for sex workers online, for nudity, getting picked up by really dodgy AI systems that recognize supposedly nudity, and then, you know, rank them lower, just make them invisible by just making them lower in the kind of in what is a kind of politics of visibility. So I think that's how they work. Again, algorithms are mysteries, little black boxes of weird.
Yeah, thank you. So free speech is almost a moot point if you're being shadow banned, like.
Oh, you can say whatever you like, because no one will see it, and the less they see it, the less likely it is that the algorithm will pick you up as popular and put you in the position of someone else. So it just perpetuates itself those ways. It's. I mean, they're just simple, absolute racist stuff. Was it Francesca Sabanda's book, I think? Anyway, talking about black bloggers, beauty bloggers, who have more followers than white beauty bloggers don't appear in people's feeds, don't appear with the same regularity as white bloggers. It's just pure racism built into this automated system because it's been trained on our racist society.
May I, sorry, following on, just whilst I've got you to speak about this, please, if you don't mind. So just while there is this sort of fear, it feels like, around for Twitter at the moment with Elon Musk buying it, an alternative, say, global ethnic majorities built our own platforms, that would be then built with different AI systems that would be the normative would not be premised on a racist or misogynist algorithm, because it would be built differently. Is that right? Well,
ideally, it depends. I mean, in pragmatic terms, they'd probably build on the base of something that already exists, because you don't want to start from scratch. You know, but ideally, yes, in an ideal world, it's possible. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. We could hope. Now we have Elon Musk's Twitter to look at.
Sure, thank you. I was also wondering earlier about education generally, and about what we're speaking to, and about the impact, about job creation in the arts. And I was just thinking about how different the landscape is for anyone entering into arts and culture professions, given that students are coming out with tens of thousands of pounds worth of debt. I thought that must have a bearing on all of this, and the professionalisation, because for my mum's era, for instance, there was a proliferation of or there were a lot of people entering art school who didn't know what they were going to do after, and would join all sorts of different professions. And it feels like actually young people are starting out, going to university, and already being steered into one category. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, professionalisation is something that's quite dominant in our education at the moment, for sure. It's on the agenda of, how do we provide these professional skills, and it's one of the measures as well for the league table, graduate outcomes and all these things as well. So but yeah, I think there's an enormous amount of debt now at the end of, an undergraduate degree. And I think there's an increasing amount of people going on to do postgraduate, because it's seen that they now need the masters as well, to be able to be in the art world, or, so yeah, it's a kind of a big concern, I guess.
Ava, is it Ava or Eva? You got your hand up there.
Yeah, hi, Eva. Thanks so much, guys. This has been so interesting and so relevant. I think I just wanted to pick up on what Dani just said in terms of, like, I'm a PhD researcher at Newcastle Uni, and some of my research is based on the kind of rise of independent ceramic schools and sort of studios. And there's definitely been a rise, I think, in independent art schools, or like a return to the art school model, which I've noticed at least. So I've just wondered if you thought that maybe like how viable that is as an alternative, or if, yeah, I guess as an alternative. I mean, I know it couldn't be quite as simple as that, but just sort of what that could mean in terms of, yeah, sort of, or like how we can use that model or kind of harness that model in terms of kind of access, community worth, social justice, etc., and kind of try to kind of steer that slightly rather than kind of focus so much on these sort of, especially in terms of art school, like you know, art education or creative education.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Thanks for asking this. I was having this conversation. I've got I'm supervising a PhD student who's looking at alternative art schools. At the moment, I was having this conversation this afternoon about thinking about care and social reproduction, actually, and how some of these alternative models also rely on that kind of as was it Kylie who said that self-exploitation, that these schools are set up because someone cares, and they want to do something differently to you know, formal higher education, and approach things differently, and that takes a lot of emotional labor a lot of the time, and a lot of care, and a lot of so there's something about thinking about the labor of the people who facilitate those alternative schools, and how that's remunerated in whichever way. But are they a viable option? Absolutely. They bring different voices, different perspectives, different ways of learning. Yeah, I think there's that, but there has to be that carefulness around the labor that's involved, and the burnout, and, you know, all the things that can happen, and the, you know, the people who facilitate these alternative schools are not paid in the same way that lecturers paid. So again, thinking about that kind of relationship and how that works, and the in order to sustain the people, you know, participating. I don't know, does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. Feel like I really want to meet that PhD student though.
I can put you in touch if you want. Yeah.
I just want to follow that on, really, because if you're trying to beat the system, I did an awful lot of trying to beat the system in my other life, running an arts organisation. And after a while, after 14 years, I had to throw in the towel on that because it wasn't a very healthy thing to do. But, you know, the system thrives because it is so hard to do anything other than that, to be independent from it, to try to plough other furrows. You know, the point of, you know, the notion of social justice is, you know, a climate, if you like, where people are enabled, people are encouraged and enabled to do the things that are important to them in the way that they are best placed because of their kind of their philosophical and their social makeup and so on. The tying down of everything into packages, you know, when I went to art school as a working class kid where nobody had been to university, and we didn't go to galleries or even the library because my dad had a bookshop, so I read all the books there. But, you know, it meant that there wasn't a barrier of money to it. Nowadays, money is a barrier to so many things. You know, and increasingly so with the huge cost of living rises that are affecting, you know, vast swathes of moving more and more people into poverty and so on. How can you consider to aspire to do something as kind of airy-fairy as becoming an artist, you know, in those kind of climates? And I think that, you know, however hard it is, and I do feel very demoralised by I certainly feel very demoralised by the political climate, but I feel very demoralised by the arts climate and the lack of equanimity, if you like, the lack of common purpose, the hyper competitive environment that we find ourselves in. but you have to keep trying, you know, and I suppose that might be written on my tombstone, who knows.
And maybe there's more things going on under the radar that we don't know about, and those things are going to happen anyway. So those things are happening and will continue to happen.
Like what?
People are doing things in spite of or not high profile. Things are happening. People are artists, collaborations are happening. Yes. Without them being high profile, but they're still happening.
Yes, I see that. I also think it's worrying, though, that there are funding bodies like Freeland's Foundation that are sort of permeating the landscape for artists. So yes, there are these alternatives happening, but then we're normalizing what isn't really very normal. Whatever Elizabeth Murdoch's independence from her father, where does that money come from actually to support that? And what does that mean when the Murdoch family are finding arts and culture so valuable? That suggests to me that whatever it is that we build, which I'm committed to 100%, along with others, it does present extra challenges when the funding is so limited to do that. Because actually what everyone said around money as well, what you were just specifically saying, actually, it's everything stems from, you were talking about neurodiversity, for instance, and whether you're neurodiverse or not, if you haven't got a place to live or a secure place to live, what do you do? What are your priorities? Your priorities are, and art, then you called it airy fairy, falls by the wayside. But actually, we know the reason that we've dedicated our lives to it is we know that art is so valuable to everyone, whether they know it or not, or whether they're accessing museums or university, or we're still influencing the general culture. I think.
And that's not always acknowledged. That level of influence is not always acknowledged. It's seen as separate, and we can dispense with that. But actually, it runs through. It's running through everybody's lives every day on some level. It's influencing.
Dave, can I ask you a question about, we're talking about alternatives and independence and like from the ground up kind of cultural practices. And I'm wondering whether there's been a change. I might have got this completely wrong, but we might have been romanticizing it back in the 70s and 80s, but it feels like independence used to be a left-wing thing, but now maybe there's a kind of neoliberal right-wing hipster version of independence, where the alternative to the mainstream is now a slightly more elite thing rather than a slightly more communal thing. Do you know what I mean? Am I reading that all wrong? But that's what it feels like to me.
I'm not sure. That's really interesting. I think there was a way in which alternative cultural institutions were very, very strongly allied with the left in the 70s and 80s. I mean, something like Grassroots Bookshop in Manchester, right in Piccadilly, very different Piccadilly Gardens to the one that exists now, and had a certain prominence. And I think libraries were connected to that as well. There was this kind of cultural infrastructure that seemed very much non-corporate and not really part of the official arts world either. I think maybe Kylie put a finger on it earlier when she was talking about the rise of more entrepreneurial forms of cultural production. I would say that's the way things have gone. I mean, people use the term DIY. You know, that's a term I hear much more for what used to be called independent, and people involved in DIY cultures of different kinds are very committed to all kinds of social justice and equality projects. So that's still alive. But DIY is, to go back to the point I was making before, is also very incorporated into the platform world, because it's just very, very difficult not to be, isn't it? I mean, it may be more possible in some sectors of arts and culture than others. You know, Jade will obviously know about that in terms of the art world that she's involved in, but in something like music, you know, okay, you can sell t-shirts and merch and CDs via Bandcamp, but you know, are you really going to be able to make a sustainable living out of that? I just wanted to throw in one further point really about the kind of the problem. Again, I'm coming at this more from the commercial cultural industries than the arts sector. That's where I tend to do most of my work. Not because I'm uninterested in art and the subsidized arts, not at all. But it seems to me that there is a structural problem that relates to these popularity effects. What some economists, again, I'm not endorsing the terminology as with oversupply, but the superstar economy. You know, the idea that something tends to happen where a relatively small group of cultural producers dominate most of the rewards, and it's kind of almost built into the cultural version of capitalism. And pushing back against that is tremendously hard, you know, because there is lots of money in these sectors. I mean, look at the investment going into television production from Netflix and Prime, but who's getting it? Only a very, very small number of people. It really is, you know, fundamentally about economic inequality, but it's going to be very hard to shift. UBI is definitely an important conversation to have in terms of social and government action, political action to try and push back against some of those effects.
Yeah, just on UBI, there's a great documentary about Australian music industry in the 70s and early 80s, and of course it was pre mutual obligation, and you could be on the dole, and the dole works as a subsidy, right? And that, you know, that was the UBI of its day, right?
So important. Unemployment benefit,
subsidy, and
yeah. And housing benefit, absolutely.
Yeah.
Sorry, you were job seekers allowance. Was that what you just mentioned about job seekers allowance?
It was before it was called job seekers allowance. It was unemployment benefit, which meant that you had right to it, and you could have it without actively seeking a job.
Yes, and
so
that's
just being unemployed. And then they changed the rules so that you had to show on a daily. You had to have a timetable of all the jobs you were applying for in order to get the benefit, and they could take it away from you if you didn't do that. And you basically can't have a studio practice and searching for jobs all the time.
No, it's impossible. So when I was talking earlier, I was in that situation. But I think by that time I was claiming for working tax credits, which actually completely saved me. So the scenario I was talking about before, I wouldn't have been able to afford to work if I hadn't had I know that doesn't make sense perhaps, but I'm sure you, in one way or another, you'll have heard that before. But yeah, sorry, I was just recalling how sort of violent it was to be in those scenarios, because being an artist was not only not valued, it was, or undermined. They told you to do something else. They didn't care if you'd got a degree in, or you trained as an artist in the job centre. It was they told you in no uncertain terms that it was not worth anything and you were not going to get anywhere pursuing it. I've had studio friends, artists who've come back completely shattered from having gone for their weekly meeting and being told choose something else, which is kind of what was suggested. Was that during the pandemic as well, where they suggested that people retrain? Yes, so and what I also see is that there is a lot of data that's offered to the government when they're making these cuts. In the billions, the culture industries generate or are exported yearly. And I wonder if, because we've, as visual artists or musicians, because we've overcome adversity. There's a lot of stories, those individual stories where people have been on the dole and then they've, found riches through their arts and they've suffered. It's like a sort of fetishization of suffering. So I wonder if in people's consciousness there's a kind of, well, whatever it generates economically, on an individual level, it doesn't matter, because people will overcome this. They're resilient artists, those that are able to, carry on will succeed, rather than looking at it holistically. It just seems that in people's in the sort of consciousness, it's undervalued, that the labour is totally undervalued that way.
Sove, are you around? So you put a question, so you wanted to ask a question, you put it in the chat, but you're muted at the moment, so don't go on.
I did put a question in the chat, but actually sort of riffing off this conversation around job seekers allowance and income support, and like Jade spoke about working tax credit, how supportive do you feel art, craft and design worlds are to the additional work practitioners, artists often do need to undertake to support themselves? I personally reached a point where I had to stop making art because I couldn't live. And I was able to retrain and begin to pay my rent and stuff again, and then I could begin making art again. So sometimes you do have to stop making work, and there's probably not people who come into these rooms, into these forums, aren't the ones who've been forced to stop making their artwork. So I was interested to hear sort of people's views on how supportive the industry, for want of a better term, is on the other work we need to do and making space for that.
I think the quick answer is that it's appalling, isn't it?
I mean, I described that as not being a friendly or supportive environment for individual artists in particular, that it's a kind of a dog eat dog. Everybody in an institution is geared to competing. The level of honest exchange between people is limited because everybody wants to get their funding, everybody wants to kind of keep their profile, everybody wants to have whoever it is that's fashionable or important first. Sharing ideas about different kinds of things really hasn't gone on. Certainly in the period when I ran an arts organisation, there was a real culture change in the way that organisations communed with each other. These strict hierarchies became very, very pronounced, and you didn't talk outside your tier, as it were. And somewhere, I remember a diagram that the Arts Council produced as part of the Turning Point strategy, and it started off with, you know, government and the Queen or whatever. And in this tiny, tiny space at the bottom, there were artists, students, and audiences, which I thought was, you know, very revealing, the way that people draw diagrams and where people are positioned. Because, of course, the assumption is that there will always be producers of artistic product, if you like. And there will always be people that you can, you know, punters that you can find to draw in on that. I mean, such a basic set of misconceptions about how good culture works, if you like.
It's interesting, Sue, because some of that hierarchy within institutions has shifted during the pandemic. Some of the things that we found in our research is that departments start to talk to each other that were historically divided and kind of merge and work together. But I think that artists being in that small section at the bottom is probably still exists, because, you know, there's so much work to do in order to overcome the precarity of being an artist. But in terms of the hierarchies within institutions, I think some of that has shifted a little bit. Whether it stays beyond the pandemic is, you know, it's a different thing.
Okay, I'm feeling more and more conscious that we've talked about people overworking and working for free and working in your own time and all of that kind of stuff, and we've been talking for quite a long time now, and people have been with us on this, and we should draw it to a close, or else we're going to carry on using up our own time. So I'm absolutely delighted, and I want to thank everybody for being here. And it's been absolutely brilliant. So thanks, everybody. And
thank you, Dave, for organising it and sharing it so well.
Thanks.
Really interesting.
Yeah, thank you.
Interesting. Yeah.
It's been really good to meet everyone as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Looking forward to going and finding your books, Dani.
Oh, Kylie, did you put your details of the book in the chat?
I thought I could attach a flyer, but just email me, find me.
Okay.
There's a couple of me in the world, but I'm the one in Ireland, so you can find me there. Shoot me an email.